Alrighty, guys. So we're going to be deviating from the text a little bit to focus on a chapter from the book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. The name of the chapter is Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? This is a fantastic book written by a guy named Robert Sapolsky. He does a fantastic job of discussing the physiological response to stress. And the book basically goes through like organ system by organ system to discuss what happens. And he does it in a very kind of layman's terms kind of fashion. Lots of humor, really excellent read, particularly for any of you who kind of are in more of a medical kind of setting. This could be a really nice complement to like a physiology or an anatomy class, just to kind of get a more laid back, humorous kind of perspective. At least for me, multiple perspectives always help to cement stuff. So would highly recommend. So to start off this discussion, which is basically going to be setting us up for a later, more in-depth discussion of stress, what I want to focus on is disease patterns. So that's kind of the foundation of, why zebras don't really get ulcers. So modern medicine has changed as disease patterns have changed over time. So infectious disease, diseases of poor nutrition, poor hygiene are things that really today only really exist in developing countries, less privileged areas of the world. But otherwise, the things that we are dealing with more so are chronic illnesses, things like heart diseases, cancers, strokes. And again, this is very different than 100 years ago. This is a relatively recent shift from, again, the things that you see impacting people more in Africa or South America today, various parts of Africa and South America. So as Sapolsky says, we are now living well enough to slowly fall apart. And this has also changed our understanding of disease. Namely, we have realized that stress can make us sick. But what stresses us out? So for us, a whole host of things stress us out. Traffic, deadlines, relationships, finances. For zebras, though, it's pretty straightforward. Serious physical injury, predators, starvation, pretty basic stuff. And at the end of the day, we as people develop things like ulcers while zebras don't. So why is that? It has to do with the types of stressors that we're exposing ourselves to. And in general, there are three different types of stressors. We've got acute physical stressors, which are short-lived, highly stressful, demand an immediate physical adaptation for survival. So these would be things like, the half-starved lion has to sprint for food, or the injured zebra has to evade the predator. If one doesn't do what they need to do, then they will die. And the body is really well adapted for such emergencies. All animal bodies are really well adapted for such emergencies. We're good at kind of rallying resources and acting quickly. Chronic physical stressors are more long-lived, but still require a physiological reaction. So this would include something like drought, famine, parasites, things that last longer, but still require physiological reactions to conserve resources, for instance. And our body is reasonably good at handling these things. Psychosocial stressors, though, these are emotional, interpersonal, messy in nature, all of our anxieties and our worries. These activate the same physiological response as the physical stressors above. However, while this response is helpful in acute situations, it's harmful if it's turned on chronically and can catalyze stress-related diseases such as ulcers over time. So why are we better adapted to certain types of stressors? It really has to do with the fact that over time, we've encountered those physical stressors for longer periods of time than we have psychosocial stressors, and evolution is very slow, so we're more adapted to those things. But beyond that, humans are really the only animal who focus in on those psychosocial stressors. All other animals are focused exclusively on the physical stressors. And again, because evolution is slow, that means that even though we have these psychosocial stressors, that we're still more adapted to those physical stressors. What's another thing that makes psychosocial stressors a little bit different? One is that there is this anticipatory quality to them that humans are prone to that can really kind of drag out the damage and the impact so much more. So to help that make a little bit more sense, let's explore the idea of homeostasis. So our brains seek this particular set point, aka homeostasis, aka the status quo. So for zebras, this means that stressors are the thing that disrupt homeostasis, and the stress response reestablishes homeostasis. So homeostasis is chilling, grazing on some grass, and then suddenly lion pops up or storm rolls in. That's a disruption to homeostasis, and then the stress response is fleeing, taking cover or shelter, whatever it is we need to do to stay alive so that we can return to homeostasis later. For humans, though, we have the ability to conceive of the future, which is very unique. And so we can become stressed, not just when homeostasis is disrupted, but when we think homeostasis may be disrupted. And so this is really how psychosocial stressors are different. You know, we aren't just stressed looking for our first job outside of college, but we're stressed years before just thinking about graduation and getting that. So this is kind of really where anxiety is born. So the stress response, at the end of the day, whether we are dealing with the psychosocial or the physical stressor, is the same. And this physical response is triggered also in humans by the expectation of disrupted homeostasis. So now we're going to kind of take that idea of homeostasis and broaden it a bit more to a term called allostasis. So homeostasis is a pretty primitive idea. It encompasses a single optimal point, like an ideal body temperature, for instance, as its set point. And to reach that ideal set point, there's some regulatory mechanism that is focused on that set point. So we've got, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit's our body temperature. And then, we've got this mechanism of sweating, potentially to help us cool down, or shivering to help us warm up. Very simple very simple system. Allostasis is a closely related construct that's a bit more accurate and of course a bit more complicated, because life's more complicated than just one number and one system. So allostasis says that our body has multiple set points and that the set points are different based on the circumstances. So for instance, your ideal heart rate is different when you're sleeping than when you're running. And it's actually considered a sign of good health for your heart rate to go up when you exercise and to come down when you're hanging out, and to also go down even further when you're sleeping. That's one of the signs of poor health and can be considered a cardiovascular risk, is if your heart rate doesn't go down at night. So allostasis says we've got multiple set points and they're different depending on what we're doing. And that each set point can be regulated in different ways, and that each mechanism has its own consequence. So for example, I'm going to compare and contrast homeostasis versus allostasis using an example that Sapolsky uses in his book, the idea of there being a water shortage in the body. So a homeostatic approach to this would be that, well, like the kidneys are responsible for relegating water to be secreted or not. So the kidneys are going to be in charge of figuring out the solution to the water shortage. An allostatic conceptualization of the same issue would be that, okay, well, no, it's a bit more complicated than the kidneys. It's the brain is in charge of telling the kidneys to withdraw water from evaporation sites. The brain's the one that's making you thirsty to take in more water. It's not just about conserving water, but bringing more on board. And so homeostasis, again, is about a single solution, versus allostasis is about kind of this coordinated set of body-wide changes. And again, allostatic disruption can be initiated by anticipation as well. So the main point of this slide is to clarify that homeostasis is basically a bit of an oversimplification, and allostasis, while more complicated, is a more accurate representation of the way that the body works. So humans become stressed when allostasis is disrupted, and also when we anticipate allostasis being disrupted. And then the stress response is what restores allostasis. So this brings us to a guy named Hans Selye. Hans Selye was an endocrinologist who in the 1930s was studying the impact of an ovarian extract on rats. And in his initial study, he injected rats with this ovarian extract on a daily basis. He wasn't very good at some of the aspects of his job, and that he was very focused on kind of research and getting good data. But he frequently missed injection sites and would end up poking the rats multiple times, or he'd drop them and have to chase them with the broom. And at the end of the study, the results were that the rats developed peptic ulcers. They also had damaged adrenal glands and shrunken immune tissue, all things that we now know to be stress-related disease. And at the time, Sully assumed basically that this was due to the extract that he injected the rats with. Fortunately, though, what he lacked in rat handling skills, he made up for in scientific thought. So he knew that he had to repeat the study with a control group to be sure. So in study number 2, he divided the rats into 2 groups. Half got the ovarian extract, half got a saline solution, but he was mistreating the rats in the same way. He was still missing injection sites, still dropping them. And at the end of the day, unsurprisingly to us, he got the same results in both groups, meaning that the ovarian extract was not the culprit. But of course, what did the 2 groups have in common? The same mistreatment. And again, Sully was savvy enough to identify this. And so in his 3rd version of this study, what he did was there was no ovarian extract, but instead he put the rats into groups and subjected each group to various stressors. So some had to live on a cold roof, some were living in a very hot boiler room, some were forced to exercise for long periods of time, some were subjected to less invasive surgical procedures. And in all cases, he saw the same results, the same peptic ulcers, the same damaged adrenal glands, and the same shrunken immune tissue. So what are the takeaways from Sully's studies? One is that the body has a surprisingly similar set of responses to a broad array of stressors. And Sully named this his general adaptation syndrome, meaning this is general, this happens in all situations, and that this is how our body adapts to stress. Today, we just call it the stress response. So this is, again, the thing that happens when humans' allostasis is disrupted, or when we anticipate our allostasis being disrupted. And we saw this happening in these rats when their allostasis was being disrupted. He also observed that if stressors go on for too long, regardless of the stressor, physical or psychosocial in nature, that this can make us sick. This can cue stress-related disease. So what happens when any one of a variety of stressors or the anticipation of such disruption triggers the stress response? What happens in the body? The body reacts. So a couple things happen. One is that the body mobilizes energy in order to fuel muscles, and our heart rate, our blood pressure, and our breathing all increase. So we're kind of revving up to fight or flee. Long-term projects are also halted. I like Sapolsky's description of this. We're halting long-term projects until we know if there's a long-term. Doesn't make any sense to direct resources to reproduction or immunity or digestion. We don't know if we need to digest that candy bar in our gut until we're sure if we survive this. We don't need to continue to divert resources to ovaries or testes to ovulate or to create sperm. We don't need to send resources to kind of create white blood cells and keep them circulating and keep our antibodies strong. You know, who cares if you catch a cold right now if you can't outrun this tiger? Pain sensitivity is decreased. This also makes sense in the context of these physical stressors that this response evolved to help address. You know, if you're running and you're injured, not so injured that you cannot continue and you would die, but, you know, injured enough, it makes sense to not feel that pain, to kind of keep going until you know you're safe, because pain's just going to slow you down. Another thing that will happen is that cognitive and sensory skills become heightened. So some people will report that in like crises type scenarios that time kind of slows and they feel they can think much more clearly, and that senses kind of improve so you can see much more clearly and hear more clearly. And one of the reasons that this is the body's reaction is because historically, the most common type of stressor that has impacted specifically vertebrates, has really focused on fighting and running. So like the lion and the zebra type of scenario. It's acute in duration, but it requires a really fast and intense scenario to run and to fight. And so that's what our body evolved to do. So why do we get sick? Sully said that his general adaptation syndrome, what he came up with, was that our body goes through 3 phases when we are stressed. First is the alarm phase, where you are kind of shocked and surprised, so to speak, by whatever the stressor is. And that initially you're actually kind of stunned, and it kind of takes you a minute, which is why you see that red line kind of dip. But then, after you kind of come back down from your shock or your surprise, you begin to mobilize your resources to kind of prepare for the stressor. And this is where we enter into our resistance phase, where we are trying to kind of run or fight, or in the case of a psychosocial stressor, you're trying to study or do whatever it is you need to do to kind of address the stressor. And then eventually we become exhausted. And so Sully said that the reason we get sick at the end of the day is because we're exhausted. We have depleted all of our resources. We cannot fight anymore. We are done. And that's when we get sick. But at the end of the day, he was incorrect in his interpretation of this 3rd stage. Resources are not depleted. It's not like we've run out of some entity that we have. Instead, it's that the stress response becomes more damaging than the stress itself. So that's why we become exhausted. It's because this response is no longer giving us a net gain in productivity. It's no longer really helping. It's actually causing more harm than good. And this is particularly true when stress is purely psychosocial, because this response has nothing to do with psychosocial stressors. And psychosocial stressors typically last much, much longer than physical ones. So what's the damage? So in the short run, what is initially energy mobilization, helping us to get those sugars and fats and carbohydrates kind of out of storage and ready to use, actually in the long term translates to us not having any surplus energy storage. So we're not really storing anything, we're just burning it as soon as we consume it. And so this leads to fatigue in the long run. What initially starts out as elevated blood pressure to kind of help get that energy to our muscles and our brain and our hearts to fight or flee turns into hypertension in the long run. Those stress hormones that help to kind of relegate all of these processes impair deep sleep in the long run. And deep sleep is a really important stage of sleep because this is the stage where human growth hormone is released, which is responsible for growth in young people. It's also what's responsible for bone and tissue repair. If you have broken a bone, or even if you've worked out and you've done some damage, you've broken down some of your muscular tissue, at night is when that repair is happening, which is why you feel pain the next morning after an intense workout. Deep sleep is also a stage where memories are consolidated as well. So in the long run, some impacts that we see of stress are inhibited growth in kids. There's actually something called stress dwarfism, which basically means that chronically stressed kids, their height can actually be diminished. One really fascinating historical example of this is J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan. He had a really stressful upbringing. I can't remember if he was the youngest or not, but he was one of several children, and his oldest brother died unexpectedly. And his oldest brother was his mother's favorite. And she was extremely depressed when he passed. Like, she spent all of her time in her room and slept a lot. And she sometimes called J.M. Barrie by his older brother's name and pretended like he was his older brother. And she would say things to him like, never grow up, just stay as you are. So those might have been some of the origins of the actual story, Peter Pan, and J.M. Barrie's kind of fixation on not growing up and remaining a child. But beyond that, J.M. Barrie was also a very short man in his adult years. Another impact potentially of poor deep sleep, in addition to inhibited growth, is poor repair and remodeling of bone and tissue. There can also be memory impairment as well, if the brain isn't able to retain new information quite as effectively. In the long run too, long-term projects turn out to be important, things like digestion and immunity and reproduction. So we're not dealing with an acute scenario like a tiger. We're dealing with something long-term and psychosocial. So it is important to digest that candy bar. It is important to continue to be reproductively viable. It is important to keep one's immune system healthy and to fight off colds and viruses. And so halted reproduction means that we might be seeing reproductive disorders, things like irregular or absent menstruation in women or low sperm count in men. A halted immune response means that we're going to see a higher risk of infectious disease. And then heightened cognitive and sensory skills in the long run can lead to brain cell deterioration and poor memory and sensation. So how does one regain allostasis then? If allostasis has been disrupted by a stressor and the stress response is turned on to try and help, but the stressor is long-term in nature, and so now the stress response is just damaging, how do we turn this off? How do we get allostasis back, since the stress response is clearly not doing anything because it evolved to deal with a different type of stressor? At the end of the day, it's difficult, but it is possible to regain allostasis. It's difficult because allostasis, unlike homeostasis, is multifaceted in nature. And so we've got kind of a lot of moving parts that all need to kind of realign themselves in, a very particular manner. The analogy I kind of give that, again, kind of compares homeostasis and allostasis is it's kind of like if I had these two sets of dominoes. One set of dominoes it's a straight line, very straightforward, and another really complicated series of dominoes, like the picture on the bottom of the screen. To stop a homeostatic stress response would kind of be like, the first domino falls over and it's starting, and you're just trying to stop the dominoes from getting to the end. It's messy, but it's relatively straightforward what you need to do. You just need to interrupt this one process. But allostasis is so much more complicated. It would be like trying to stop the set of dominoes on the bottom side of the screen once it's already started. Possible, but definitely more complicated, and it's requiring more finesse and balance and coordination across multiple systems. Some of the things that make it difficult to turn allostasis off is that it requires a lot of energy, which we don't really have because the stress response depletes energy. You saw on the earlier slide that fatigue is a symptom of chronic stress. So we need a lot of energy to turn the system off, but energy is also something that we don't really have a lot of. It's also very difficult to, in the case of trying to stop the dominoes on the bottom side of the screen, it would be really difficult to stop the dominoes without like knocking the dominoes over in another area. So it's difficult to stop one problem without causing another. And again, that's kind of an analogy to what the body is really like, is it kind of takes this coordinated effort to turn off all of these systems at once. And so allostatic load is the term that we use to refer to the collective damage of allostasis being disrupted in the first place. So the damage done by the stress response being turned on chronically, but also damage done potentially by trying to regain allostasis and doing so in a fairly clunky manner. So the take-home points that I want you guys to really kind of cement in your brains before we talk about stress more next week is that, one, if you repeatedly turn on the stress response, if it's turned on chronically, or if you cannot turn it off, if you can't turn off the stress response after a stressful event, the stress response can become damaging. On the opposite side of things, it's also critical that the stress response turns on in the first place, because avoiding the response entirely is not without its problems. For example, Shy-Drager syndrome and Addison's disease are two diagnoses where a person basically has a difficult time activating the stress response in the first place. And symptoms include things like having a difficult time standing because their blood pressure is so low. It takes the stress response to respond to really simple things like standing up. So they will faint, become dizzy, have muscle spasms, and shock sometimes happens as well. So just avoiding the stress response is not the answer. The stress response is very needed for certain things. It's just more about coping with stress and managing one's stress and being cognizant of what's happening in one's body, which we'll talk more about in chapter 5 when we go over coping with stress. A final point that I'll make is that stress increases your risk of getting diseases that make you sick. So a lot of people like to say that stress makes you sick, and that's kind of a misnomer. Stress doesn't magically make you sick. What it does is that it depresses your immune system, which makes it more likely that you will acquire a disease, which will then make you sick. All right, so that is my summary of Robert Sapolsky's Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? Please read the whole chapter, and we will talk more about stress next time. Bye-bye.